The valley had no name on any map that mattered. It existed in that particular category of places the military preferred to leave unnamed, not out of laziness, but out of a quiet, professional acknowledgement that naming something gave it weight, gave it meaning, and some places were better left without either. The topographers who had charted this region of the Hindu Kush decades ago had sketched the valley in pencil, labeled it Sector 7, Foxtrot, and moved on. The pencil marks were almost certainly faded by now. The valley did not care either way. What the valley had, in abundance, was cold. Not the cold of a New England winter, the kind that made civilians pull their coats tighter and complain about the heating bill. This was structural cold, cold that had weight and intention. The kind of cold that didn't descend from the sky so much as rise from the earth itself, from the permafrost packed 3 meters deep beneath the snowpack, from the granite bones of the mountains that bracketed the valley on 3 sides and kept the wind in a permanent, circular howl. The temperature, according to the last functioning thermometer in the unit's kit, was reading -31 Celsius. That had been 40 minutes ago. The thermometer had stopped working since. Staff Sergeant Decker Hollis pressed his back against the boulder and tried to remember how to breathe slow. The trick, the one they taught at Bud's, and the one most men forgot the moment real cold introduced itself, was to breathe through the nose, not the mouth. Mouth breathing in this temperature meant moisture leaving the body with every exhale, meant dehydration compounding on top of hypothermia, meant the gradual mental fog that killed men not with drama, but with quiet administrative efficiency. He pressed his lips together, breathed through his nose, counted to 4 on the inhale, held it, 4 on the exhale. Around him, the 7 remaining members of SEAL Team 4's Bravo element were distributed behind whatever cover the terrain offered, which wasn't much. The valley floor here was a bowl, a natural amphitheater carved by some glacier that had retreated 10,000 years ago and left this geometry behind as a parting gift. Steep rock faces on 3 sides. The 4th side, the north end, was the way they'd come in. It was also, now, the direction from which the enemy fire was coming. Chief Petty Officer Raymond Garrett was 3 meters to Hollis's left, flat behind a snow ridge that had been chest-high 2 hours ago and was now, through some combination of wind and blown powder, down to maybe mid-thigh. Not enough. Hollis could see the tension in Garrett's shoulders from here, the specific, coiled stillness of a man who was doing the mathematics of survival and not liking the answer. Behind them both, wedged into a shallow crevice that offered slightly more protection, Petty Officer Marcus Webb was applying a field dressing to the left thigh of Petty Officer 2nd Class Jonah Steele. The dressing was already saturated. Steele had been hit 18 minutes ago by a fragment, not a direct shot, but enough. The fragment had clipped the femoral. Not severed, its severed would have been quicker, but nicked it in that precise, catastrophic way that made every heartbeat into a transaction, every minute spent without a surgical team, a withdrawal from an account that was running very low. Hollis had done the calculation. He didn't share it with anyone. The comms had gone dark 45 minutes into the operation. Not jammed, the equipment wasn't behaving the way it behaved under electronic warfare. It was the cold. The cold had simply reached inside the radio housing and informed the lithium batteries that it was time to stop working. The backup handsets were in the pack that Petty Officer 1st Class David Carver had been carrying when he went down in the first volley. The pack was out there somewhere in the open ground to the north. 50 meters. Could have been 500. Hollis had considered going for it twice. Both times the sniper, whoever he was, wherever he was positioned, had put a round within 8 inches of his head the moment he shifted his body more than 45 degrees. The sniper was good, patient. He wasn't suppressing them. He was managing them, keeping them pinned in this bowl with surgical precision, saving his ammunition for the moment when whoever was coordinating the assault decided it was time to come in and finish it. That moment, Hollis understood with the clarity that extreme stress sometimes provided, was not far off. Garrett. He kept his voice below the wind. Just below. Sound traveled strangely in these terrain shapes. Garrett turned his head a fraction. Count. Where are we? Garrett's lips moved. He held up 4 fingers, then closed his fist. 4 rounds left in his primary. His secondary, Hollis knew without asking, was somewhere at the bottom of that drop when the first ambush hit, and he'd gone sideways down the slope and come up without it. 4 rounds. Hollis had 7, Webb had 11. Steele wasn't shooting anything. The 2 men on the far side of the bowl, Corpsman Timothy Hale and Petty Officer Blake Morrison Hollis, hadn't been able to communicate with for the last 12 minutes. He could see Morrison's silhouette occasionally when the wind shifted the powder. He was still moving, still upright. That was the most he could confirm. The wind gusted. Hollis tucked his chin into his chest and waited for it to pass. When it eased, he became aware of something he hadn't heard before. Silence. Not the silence of the valley. The valley was never silent. The wind saw to that. Something else. A secondary silence beneath the wind. The specific absence of the near-miss cracks that the sniper's rounds had been producing. He hadn't fired and Hollis glanced at his watch 6 minutes. That was either very good or very bad. He was betting on very bad. The sniper had stopped firing for a reason. Hollis knew this the way he knew most things. That kept him alive not through analysis but through the deep, precognitive alarm system that the military spent years cultivating in its operators and that no amount of training could fully explain. The sniper wasn't gone. He hadn't run out of patience. He had been given a signal, or received an order, or made a professional decision. Don't waste ammunition on containment when the assault is 90 seconds out. They're moving, he said quietly. Garrett was already shifting his angle, trying to get eyes on the north approach without exposing himself. Can't see anything. They're moving. Garrett accepted this the way experienced men accepted things from experienced partners. No argument, just adjustment. Hollis turned and caught Webb's eye. Webb looked up from Steele's leg. His face was a careful, controlled mask, but his eyes communicated the truth without any words. We have maybe 5 minutes of useful pressure on this before it doesn't matter anymore. Hollis gave him a single nod that meant I know and keep going at the same time. He thought, briefly, about the mission brief. 12 hours ago they had been sitting in a plywood-walled room at Bagram with maps on a folding table and a satellite image printed on photo paper that was already curling at the corners from the dry air. The target was a logistics node. A cache of hardware that had been tracked across 3 countries and 2 separate intelligence assessments, and which someone several pay grades above Hollis had decided needed to be rendered non-functional before it reached its intended destination. Simple interdiction. In and out. 8 men, 12 hours, exfil via the southern route. Simpler. The word had a particular flavor now. What no one had anticipated, or what someone had anticipated and buried in the risk assessment appendix that nobody read, was the secondary element, not the guards at the cache, who had been neutralized cleanly in the first 4 minutes. The second group, the one that had materialized from the north, approached with a tactical sophistication that suggested prior knowledge of the op, maybe not the specific details, but the general shape of it. Someone had talked, or someone had been watching. Or the satellite imagery had been older than the metadata suggested, and the situation on the ground had shifted in the intervening weeks. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the mathematics. 8 men in, 2 down hard, 1 bleeding out, 4 rounds in the senior man's rifle, no comms, and a sniper who had just gone quiet. Hollis became aware of something at the periphery of his vision. Movement. Not from the north, from the east. The east face of the valley was a near vertical rock wall, 60 meters of granite and ice. No one came from the east face. It was physically inaccessible. He'd assessed it the moment they'd entered the valley, because assessing exit routes was as automatic as breathing. No handholds, no ledge system. A 40-degree overhang at the top that made it impassable even with equipment they didn't have. Something was moving down it anyway. He watched. A figure. Small. Moving with a specific, unhurried competence that was incongruous with the angle and the conditions. Not repelling, there was no rope visible. Moving hand to foot across the rock face the way a person moved when they had done this particular route enough times to have memorized it. When the rock face was no longer terrain to be conquered but simply a path they happened to know. The figure reached the snow at the base of the east wall and straightened. Small, slight, the kind of frame that clothing hung loose on, wrapped now in layers that didn't constitute any uniform. Hollis recognized not military, not any military. Civilian gear, or something assembled from civilian and military components without apparent concern for regulation. A jacket that had once been a specific color and was now the color of something that had been through a great deal. trousers tucked into boots that were laced with a precision that seemed almost compulsive against the chaos of everything else. And standing against the white of the snow, what registered first was not the rifle. It was the hands. Both hands were visible, arms slightly out from the body, the posture of someone moving through a contested space who wanted to be seen, not drawing. The hands were bare despite the temperature, and from this distance, 30 meters, closing slowly, Hollis could see that they were covered, both of them, to somewhere above the wrists, in ink. The figure stopped, looked at him. How many? A voice pitched low, aimed precisely, carried by the wind without being lost to it. Hollis stared. How many shooters? The figure said again, with the particular patience of someone clarifying a question for someone who is processing too slowly. North approach. How many? She was young. That was the first thing that assembled itself into coherent thought once the shock moved through and passed. Young in a way that made no sense against the backdrop of what she'd just done, descending an impassable rock face in -31-degree cold, as though it were a minor inconvenience, arriving at the precise moment when arrival was necessary, speaking with the flat, information economy tone of someone who had been in enough bad situations to stop wasting words on the ones that were merely terrible. Not young the way a child was young. Young the way some people were young, a matter of bone structure and proportion rather than experience. A face that would have looked at home in a high school hallway if the eyes hadn't been doing something else entirely. The eyes were doing the thing that eyes did after they had seen enough of a particular category of event, not hardened, exactly, because hardness implied a closing off, and these eyes were wide open, just still. The way deep water was still. She was maybe 16, if you were being generous, maybe less. Garrett had shifted to look at her now, and Hollis could see on his face the same rapid recalibration that was happening in his own skull. Behind them, Webb had gone quiet, his attention split between Steele's leg and this new variable. 2, Hollis said, because the question had been specific and operational, and he had no reason not to answer it. Maybe 3. Sniper went cold 6 minutes ago. She processed this, nodded once, moved to the boulder to his right without waiting for an invitation, and brought the rifle up to her shoulder in a single fluid motion that contained no hesitation and no ceremony. She pressed herself against the rock with the specific economy of someone who understood cover, not just concealing herself behind it, but using the geometry of it, the angle, the way the rock's profile would mask her barrel from certain directions while still allowing a line on others. Hollis looked at the rifle. It was a bolt action. Long. Old in the way that things that worked perfectly were old, maintained rather than replaced, each component carried to the end of its useful life and no further. He recognized the basic platform, or thought he did, but the modifications were extensive and specific in ways that suggested whoever had made them knew exactly what they were doing. The scope was not standard. The barrel was not standard. The stock had been shaped, hand-shaped, from the look of the tool marks to fit the specific dimensions of the person holding it. She hadn't looked at him since she'd taken position. He watched her scan. It was not the scan of a trained operator going through a protocol. It was something older and more particular. The scan of a person who had been doing this specific thing, in this specific type of terrain for long enough that the visual assessment was happening below conscious thought, the way an experienced driver's hands corrected for a road surface before the brain had registered the change. Tattoos, Morrison said, from somewhere to the right. He'd materialized while Hollis was watching the woman, drifting closer with the quiet instinct of someone moving toward information. Morrison's voice carried a specific inflection, not hostile, not fully credulous, the sound of a man trying to locate a category for something that resisted categorization. She didn't respond. Hey. This was Garrett, and it had a harder edge. Not hostile, but establishing something. I need to know who you are before. You need to know where the sniper is, she said, still not looking at them. You need to know how many men are 90 seconds behind him. You need to know whether your man in the crevice has another 4 minutes or 2. A pause. You don't need to know who I am. Silence. Hollis looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back. She's right, Webb said quietly. From the crevice. Garrett exhaled. Set his jaw. Turned back to the north approach. Hollis did not turn back. He stayed watching her. Not because he distrusted her, his read. The same precognitive read that had told him the sniper was moving said not a threat, not in the way you're worried about because the hands were still bothering him. In the cold, in the field, you didn't leave your hands bare. You didn't leave your hands bare because without fine motor control you couldn't work a trigger, couldn't clear a malfunction, couldn't do any of the 100 small mechanical tasks that the difference between alive and not alive often reduced to. Even in temperate conditions. In this temperature, exposed skin began losing sensation in approximately 4 minutes. Her hands were bare, and they were covered in ink. Not decorative ink, or not only decorative. Not the kind of tattooing that happened in a shop on a Friday night after a few drinks. These were deliberate, precise, placed with spatial intention. The back of her right hand carried something that looked like coordinates, not decorative coordinates, not coordinates of a romantic location, but the kind of notation that appeared on military maps in the specific format that was used in operational planning. The left hand had a series of marks that ran from the wrist toward the palm, small hash marks, organized in groups of 5, like a count. He counted without meaning to. 3 complete groups of 5, 2 additional marks. 17. Why so many tattoos, little girl? He hadn't entirely meant to say it out loud. She turned her head, slowly, and looked at him. The look was not angry. It was not cold in the emotional sense, though the temperature around them was cold enough to crack stone. It was the look of someone who had been asked a question that they'd heard before, or a variant of it who had encountered it enough times that the act of being asked no longer produced a reaction, only an acknowledgement. Each one is a name, she said. Then she looked back through her scope. Hollis found he had nothing to say to that. Garrett was watching too now. The north approach temporarily secondary. Whose names? She didn't answer immediately. She was tracking something through the scope. He could see the micro adjustments of her position, the way her weight shifted a fraction of a centimeter to compensate for wind he could feel but hadn't consciously registered. The adjustment was so small it was almost invisible. The muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. People who were here, she said finally, and then weren't. She moved the scope a half-inch to the right. Back. Some of them were mine to lose. The way she said it was not self-pity. It was recitation. The difference was audible if you were listening for it. Some of them nobody could have kept. From the left side of the boulder, Morrison had angled himself to look at the left hand. He was doing the same math Hollis had done. Hollis watched him arrive at the same number, watched the number register in his face. 17, Morrison said quietly. 18, she corrected, still watching through the scope. The last one isn't finished yet. The wind picked up. Snow moved horizontally. For approximately 4 seconds, the visibility dropped to near zero. When it cleared, she had adjusted her position. They've got a drone, she said. Coming from the northeast, about 200 meters. Moving slow, a beat. They're using it to final position before they come in. Hollis felt the information land with the cold efficiency of a diagnosis. A drone was why the sniper had gone quiet. The drone was doing the terminal targeting, confirming their exact positions before the assault element moved in. Once the assault element had the drone's feed, they'd know exactly where everyone was. The cover they were using became irrelevant. The boulder, the crevice, the snow ridge, all of it mapped. All of it communicated to men with the position information they needed to close the final distance with minimum exposure to themselves. "Can you hit it?" Hollis asked. He meant it as a practical question. He heard, as he said it, that it was also a test. She didn't treat it as either. "Yes," she said, with the specific simplicity of a statement of fact. "Blade." He processed this. "You're going to hit a moving drone with a single round." The rotor blade, still not looking at him, hit the blade at the right angle and it fragments. The fragment takes the motor housing. The motor housing has the battery. The battery, she paused. The tiniest pause. You don't want to be standing below it when the battery goes. Garrett made a sound that might, in better circumstances, have been a laugh. "How far is your effective range?" Hollis asked. She considered this with an honesty that he found, strangely, more reassuring than confidence would have been. In this wind, this temperature, another micro-adjustment to her position. "I need it at 150 meters or less." "You said 200. It's moving toward us." He looked at her. "At the ink on the hands, at the hash mark 17, she'd said, and the 18th not finished. He thought about what it meant to carry a count like that. Not the romantic version of it, the Hollywood version where the lone warrior marked their kills in clean, dramatic lines. The real version. What it meant to have enough losses, enough missions, enough specific terrible nights to need a physical record of them, because the alternative, keeping the count only in your head, was no longer viable. He thought about Carver, out there in the snow. He thought about Steele in the crevice with Webb's hands pressing down on a saturated dressing. Okay, he said. The drone was not military specification. She'd seen enough of them to know. Military drones, the ones operated by sophisticated state actors, had a specific sound signature and a specific movement pattern, the kind of precision that came from high-quality stabilization hardware and professional operators. This one moved with the slightly jerky variability of commercial-grade equipment, which meant it was operated by someone with skill, but not by a professional drone pilot, and it meant the stabilization was doing what it could with hardware that cost a fraction of what it should have. It was still a target. She tracked it through the scope. The wind was the problem. Not because she couldn't calculate for wind. She'd been calculating for wind in this particular type of terrain for longer than some of the men crouching behind the boulder had been in uniform. The problem was that wind at this altitude and in this valley geometry was not a constant. It was a conversation between the rock faces and the gradient and the temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridge. It changed. Not randomly. Nothing in the physical world changed randomly. If you understood the underlying dynamics, but in patterns that were too complex to model in real time by anyone who hadn't spent years learning to read this specific category of environment. She had spent years. She breathed in through the nose. The cold air hit the back of her throat like swallowing a blade. She held it, let the body go still the way bodies went, still when they stopped fighting the cold and started simply existing in it. She had learned this at a cost she did not think about while working. You did not think about costs while working. You paid the costs in the gaps between, in the moments when there was nothing to do but exist, and then you put them away and worked. The drone was at 180 meters. She identified the blade configuration. 4 rotors, standard quad setup. The rear left rotor was the one. She'd worked this geometry before. The rear rotor on the upwind side created the slight oscillation in the drone's movement that briefly, for approximately 0.2 of a second at a time, created a clear angle on the motor housing junction. 0.2 of a second. The Sergeant Hollis, she'd caught the name from the interaction between the men, had moved to her left without being asked. Not crowding her, giving her room. He was watching the north approach from a new angle, providing the lookout function that she couldn't manage while her eye was in the scope. She had not asked him to do this. He had done it because he understood the operational geometry. She filed this observation away in the part of her mind that assessed people. 165 meters. The sniper had moved. She could feel it, the way you could feel weather changing, not see it, not hear it, but sense the shift in the weighted silence of someone who was repositioning. He was coming around, probably trying to get an angle on whoever he'd seen arrive from the east face. He was professional enough to know that his containment strategy had acquired a new variable. She needed the drone down before he finished his repositioning. Once he was back in position with her as a target, the calculation changed. 152 meters. She let the world reduce. The cold stopped being cold. The wind stopped being a factor she was managing and became simply a force she was incorporating. The way a good swimmer didn't fight the current but found the angle through it. The sound of the men behind her, their breathing, the faint wet sound of pressure being applied to a wound, the creak of Garrett shifting his weight went below hearing. There was the scope. There was the rotor. There was the wind, which she knew. There was the cold, which she'd made peace with a long time ago. The drone held steady at 152. The operator was stopping to get his feed. This was it. This was the terminal positioning moment. In the next 30 seconds, the men to the north would have everything they needed. 9. She found the oscillation pattern. Not random, cyclical. Every 4 seconds, approximately, the rear left rotor produced that micro instability as the upwind turbulence hit it at the right angle. 8. She found the cycle. 7. She began timing it. Once, the blade coming around, the oscillation, there, gone. She let the next cycle pass without firing. Confirming the timing. 4 seconds. There. Consistent. 5. The next cycle. 4. She took half a breath and stopped. 3. The world narrowed to the space between the center of the reticle and the rotor housing and the 17-centimeter window of angle that the oscillation created. Somewhere to her left, Hollis said something quiet and urgent. She registered it at the same level she registered everything now, which was to say, it entered the sensory field and was assessed and was not acted upon because it was not the trigger. The oscillation peaked. She fired. The sound was wrong. That was the first thing that registered. Not the impact, not the result, but the sound. In the compressed acoustic geometry of the Valley Bowl, a rifle shot should have echoed, should have bounced off the rock faces and the snowpack and come back at them from 3 directions simultaneously, the audio signature of a gunshot in enclosed terrain. Instead, the shot seemed to be absorbed. The sound went out and did not come back, or came back so changed by the cold and the wind that it barely registered as the same event. Then the drone screamed. Not a human sound. A mechanical scream, the sound of a motor experiencing catastrophic asymmetric stress. 1 rotor blade gone, the remaining 3 trying to compensate and failing. The drone pitched. The stabilization software, whatever commercial package the operator was using, pushed back, corrected, overcompensated. The pitch became a yaw. The yaw became a roll. It was falling when the battery went. She had moved 2 steps to the left before she fired, repositioning behind the extension of the boulder. She had done this without announcing it, because announcing it would have taken a full second, and she didn't have a full second to spend. Hollis had moved with her instinctively, or coincidentally, she didn't know which, and it didn't matter. The result was the same. When the battery went and the drone's lithium cell vented catastrophically, the pressure wave went into open space rather than into anyone's back. The sound was significant. Not massive by the standards of the weaponry both sides had been deploying, but sudden and bright, and it produced a secondary effect that she had calculated and that she allowed herself, briefly, to be satisfied by. The detonation was directly above the north approach, above the point where the assault element was staging. Not close enough to produce casualties at the outer range of the element. Close enough to produce the thing that was, in this situation, more valuable than casualties. Confusion. A 3-second window of operational confusion. Men ducking, men losing their visual, men going to a defensive posture, because the brain, when it registers an explosion overhead, defaults to incoming before it processes where from and why, and is this actually a threat? 3 seconds in which trained men with good instincts were operating on instinct rather than training, and instinct told them to be small. Hollis was moving before the echo of the battery detonation finished. She watched him go, not the whole movement. She was already resetting her position, finding the sniper's new angle but enough to note the economy of it, the specific, efficient quality of his movement through the snow. He went for the comms pack on the body in the open ground, reached it in 6 seconds, was back in cover in 9. He moved like he was made of something denser than ordinary people, like gravity had a stronger claim on him, like each footfall was deliberate rather than athletic. He was back behind the boulder before the confusion window closed. She heard the hiss and crackle of the comms pack attempting to cycle up, struggling against the cold-soaked batteries trying to hold charge. Not enough. She could hear it from here, the frequency, the hesitation. Not dead, not full. Partial, Hollis said quietly. Enough. Good enough. A partial comms signal in the right frequency range could still put a query to someone who was looking for them. She'd found the sniper. He was not where she'd expected. He'd moved faster than the repositioning she'd sensed, not completed it, abandoned it. He'd gone to ground instead, probably the moment the drone detonated, because a professional would recognize the drone as the target and recognize that whoever hit the drone had optics on the field and might have optics on him. He was somewhere in the rocks at the north approach's left margin, pressed low, invisible. Almost invisible. People who were pressed low in snow, in cold, without moving, produced a heat signature too faint to matter most of the time. But they also displaced snow when they arrived, and the displaced snow settled differently, slightly whiter on the surface, slightly more compacted in the structure, and in this light, with this angle of overcast sky diffusing the gray evenly across the white, The displacement was visible to someone who had looked for it before. She found it. She waited. The window was closing. The assault element would recover from the confusion in approximately 60 more seconds. They would count personnel, confirm no casualties, receive a status from the sniper, and then they would make the decision, press the assault at reduced confidence, or withdraw to replan. She could not know which they would choose, but she could remove the variable that most directly threatened the men behind her. She could remove the sniper. She waited for him to move. He was good. He did not move for 40 seconds. 40 seconds in that cold, prone on the snow, was a specific kind of discipline. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She accorded him, in the silent accounting she maintained for opponents, the respect of recognizing the competence. Then he moved, because he had to, because the cold demanded it, because lying still at -31 degrees was a countdown, not a viable tactical position. And eventually, the countdown overrode the discipline. He shifted his left elbow, fractionally, trying to get blood moving. She was already at the trigger. Her second shot of the day was quieter than the first. Less drama. No secondary explosion. The valley absorbed it the same way it had absorbed the first. The sound going out and not coming back. In the rocks at the north margin, nothing moved. Snow fell. It had been falling the whole time. Of course, it had been falling since before they entered the valley, fine and constant and indifferent. But now, with the gunfire stopped and the drone gone, and the assault element apparently making the decision to withdraw, she could hear it, in the distance, the specific sound of disciplined movement away from a position rather than toward one. The snow was all there was. The wind had dropped. This sometimes happened in these valleys after a period of sustained gusting. The weather system shifted its pressure balance. The gradient changed, and for a few minutes the air went nearly still. The silence it produced was not peaceful. It was the silence of something holding its breath. Hollis stepped out from behind the boulder and stood in the open. He stood there for a full 5 seconds, which was either professional risk tolerance or proof that his read on the situation was the same as hers. The field was clear, the sniper was down, the assault element was gone or going, and the immediate threat had passed into a different register. No longer the acute threat of being shot in the next 15 seconds, but the chronic threat of cold and injury, and no extraction. He stood there for 5 seconds, and she watched him stand there, and she understood what he was doing. He was counting the silence the way you counted the beats between lightning and thunder, measuring the distance between what had just happened and whatever came next. "Garrett," he said finally, not loud, "get Steele ready to move." Garrett's voice came back from behind the snow ridge. "Move where?" "South. The way we came in. We go south, we get to the ridge line, we get elevation, and the comms pack has enough to ping on the emergency frequency." He turned and looked at her. "You said the pack had 4 minutes." She looked at Steele in the crevice. Webb was still working. 2 now. Hollis absorbed this without changing his expression. "We move in 60 seconds. She watched the men organize around this instruction with the specific efficiency of people who were trained to transform information into action without the processing stage most people required. Morrison appeared from the far side of the bowl. Hale, the corpsman. She had noted his medical equipment during her initial assessment materialized and moved immediately to Webb, the two of them performing the rapid transition of Steele from prone to a supported carry without consultation. The movements dovetailed the way movements did when people had trained together long enough. Hollis was watching her. "You coming?" he said. "I'll cover the south approach while you move." He looked at her for a moment. "And after that?" "After that, you'll be out of the approach window and I'll be unnecessary." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. He was a large man. The kind of large that came from a specific combination of genetics and the particular physical demands of what he did. And he was standing in a posture that was neither aggressive nor deferential, but simply present, the way people stood when they were not performing anything, when they were simply occupying space with all of themselves. "I know," she said. She moved to the south margin of the bowl and set up to cover while they carried Steele toward the south approach. They stopped twice on the south approach. Once because Hale needed to adjust the carry and check the dressing it held, barely, the bleeding slowing from the cold as much as the pressure. Once because the partial comms pack, despite everything, managed to produce a coherent signal on the emergency frequency for approximately 4 seconds before the battery finally gave. 4 seconds was enough. The ping went out with their GPS coordinates. Someone, somewhere, would have received it. The second stop was where he asked her. Not about the tattoos. Not again, not directly. He asked it sideways. The way people asked things when they'd figured out that direct questions were going to be deflected. "Ghost sniper," he said. "That's what we called you." She was watching the ridge above them, not looking at him. "I know. We were told you were dead. 18 months ago." A pause. "Everyone was told you were dead. Everyone was wrong. There was a valley. East of here, maybe 40 kilometers. There was a mission that went wrong and a unit that didn't. I know what happened to the unit," she said. The flatness in her voice was not a wall. He understood. It was a load-bearing surface, the kind of flatness that held weight. 6 of them, he said quietly. 7. She did not look away from the ridge. Everyone miscounted. Everyone always miscounts one. He said nothing. The last hinge was a corpsman named Gerald Barton, she said. He got across. He was the 7th. He made it maybe 300 meters further than the others. The count was wrong in the debrief because nobody wanted to go back and look closer. A pause. I looked closer. The wind moved through the ridge rocks above them with a sound like breathing. She had been there, he understood. She had been there for the aftermath of whatever had happened in that valley, 40 kilometers east, and she had been the only one left. And she had survived the winter, the whole winter, alone in terrain where experienced units equipped with full supply chains routinely lost people in the first 48 hours. She had survived it because she had been trained to survive it, or because she was the kind of person who survived things regardless of whether they'd been trained for it, or both. The tattoos were not a record of kills. He had thought that at first, the hash marks, the count, the tally of 17 with an 18th unfinished, and it was wrong, or not entirely right. They were a record of presence, of people who had been in a specific valley on a specific night and who were no longer anywhere. She had put their number on her skin because she was the only one left to carry the count, and if she didn't carry it, the count would be 0, and 0 was unbearable. The coordinates on the right hand, he said. The valley. So you don't forget where it is. So I don't forget where they are. A small correction, delivered without emphasis. There's a difference. He looked at the ink on her hands and thought about 17 names and one unfinished mark and what it meant to carry that on your body where you could not avoid seeing it, where the cold and the wind could not strip it away. You came back to this region, he said. I didn't leave this region. 18 months. The winter was bad. The spring was usable. The summer I spent further south logistics. The fall, back north. She paused. I know this valley. I know most of the valleys in a 60-kilometer radius. I know where the approaches are and where the cover is and where the water runs under the ice in February. Another pause. I knew where you were going to be before you were there. I know these valleys the way you know the inside of your own kit. Hollis processed this. She had been out here, alone, for 18 months, operating, surviving, returning, again and again, to a territory that had taken 7 people from her. Not because she couldn't leave, she could leave, clearly. A woman who could descend an impassable rock face and drop a drone at 150 meters in a crosswind could manage an exfil through hostile terrain if she chose to. But because this was where she was. Why? He said. She finally looked at him. The look was neither hard nor soft. It was the look of someone who had been asked the question that was actually the right question for the first time in a long time. Because no one came back for them, she said. So I did. The extraction came in 4 hours and 11 minutes from the emergency ping. 2 birds, coming in from the south, moving low under the cloud ceiling that had thickened during the afternoon. Hollis had counted the minutes on a watch that had continued working because he kept it inside his layers against his chest. Steel had made it, barely, and Hollis knew the margin was thin enough that the 4 hours would be the subject of one of those quiet conversations that happen between commanders and medical staff after operations, the kind where the math of survival was assessed without the people who'd been inside it. He had spent 2 of those 4 hours talking to her. Or listening, mostly. She didn't talk in the way people talked when they were finally given the chance. She talked in the way people talked when they were accustomed to silence, and found words occasionally useful. Short accounts, operational detail rather than emotional narrative. What she'd eaten, what she'd used, how the winter had moved through the mountain chain, and what it had done to the terrain. He learned that her name was Clara Weathers. He learned that she'd been attached to a special operations element as a designated marksman, then reassigned again, in the way that people with certain skill sets were sometimes moved around until they arrived somewhere. Their skills were maximally useful, and they were categorically impossible to replace. He learned that the element she'd been with in the valley 40 kilometers east had not been her first, and that the valley had not been her first bad night, only the one that had finally resolved into 18 months of solitary presence in a mountain region, carrying the count. He did not ask her to come back with them, not directly. What he said was, "There are people who would want to know you're alive." She looked at him. "There are people who were informed I was dead and made their adjustments. Opening that back up does not serve them. It might serve you." "I serve myself adequately," she said, without arrogance, simply a statement of demonstrated fact. "The 18th, he said, "the mark that isn't finished." She looked at her left hand. The wrist. The 17 completed marks and the one begun but not resolved. The line that stopped halfway through without the second stroke that would complete it. "It's the one I haven't found yet," she said. "Gerald Barton. I told you everyone miscounted. He made it further than anyone confirmed. That means..." She stopped, started again. "That means I haven't looked closely enough. He might have made it to cover. He might have. Clara." She stopped. 18 months, he said. She looked at the ridge above them, at the snow, at the gray sky that was beginning, at its edges, to lighten toward the particular non-color that preceded darkness at altitude. "I know," she said. "You know, knowing and being done with it are different things." She pulled the sleeve of her jacket down over her wrist. The motion was not dramatic. It was the motion of someone covering a wound that was still processing. You survive as long as I've survived in this terrain, by not being done with things before they're done. He had no answer for that. The sound of the rotors came first as a vibration through the snow, then as a sound beneath the wind, then as the full noise of 2 helicopters coming in low and fast over the southern ridgeline. He stood. She stayed where she was. "Come with us," he said. She looked up at him. In the dimming light, with the helicopters coming in and the snow picking up again, she looked very young. Not in the way he'd thought initially, not the absence of experience, but the presence of something else. Something that hadn't been ground away by the years and the valleys and the 17 names. Something that was still intact in a way that a person could not have explained but could have recognized if they'd been paying the right kind of attention. "You survived," she said. "That's enough." "That's not." Hollis. His name, first time she'd used it. "You survived. Your men survived. What I did here today is not a transaction that requires a conclusion." She stood, lifting the rifle in one clean motion. "You owe me nothing. I owe you nothing. The account is clear." He looked at her. "The helicopter is 30 seconds, she said. He turned and walked toward the landing zone. He walked because she was right about the helicopter, and he was right that he would argue further if he stayed. And arguing further would not change anything, and he knew it. Some things you recognized when you were looking at them, even if you didn't have the category for it. She was one of those things. She had decided a long time ago in a valley 40 kilometers east what she was for and what she was doing and who she was doing it for, and nothing he said in 30 seconds before a helicopter was going to renegotiate that decision. He helped load steel, confirmed hail, counted the others. 7 in, 7 out, minus Carver, who had been recovered. They'd gone back, under cover from Morrison, during the wait, and was now wrapped in a body bag in the rear of the second bird, with the specific, terrible dignity that military dead were afforded. He looked back. The snow was falling harder now. The gray light was failing. At the margin of what was still visible, where the Valley Bowl's south approach met the open terrain of the approach, there was a figure, standing still, watching them lift off. He kept his eyes on her until the helicopter banked south and the valley disappeared below the rotor wash and the cloud ceiling closed over the gap, and there was nothing left to see. She watched the helicopters go until they were sound, and then until they were nothing. The valley returned to itself. Snow, wind, the specific silence of a place that did not require the presence of humans and did not particularly mourn their absence. She stood in it for a while without moving, the way she stood in places after they had contained something and then released it. There was a specific quality to such places, a residue that was not mystical, but that was real. The physical reality of disturbed air settling, of compacted snow slowly releasing, of a landscape returning to its baseline state. She thought about Hollis. She thought about the specific look on his face when she had turned to walk away. Not betrayal, not anger, but the look of a man who was doing a calculation that wasn't adding up to a number he recognized. She had seen that look before, on other men and other women, in other valleys and on other days. It was the look of someone encountering a situation that their training and their experience and their understanding of the way human beings organize themselves did not have a category for. She was not a category. She had been, once. She had been a designation, a call sign, a skill set applied in a direction determined by people who sat in plywood-walled rooms with satellite images and folding tables. She had been a specialist, a resource, a variable in someone's operational planning. She had been all of those things, and she had done all of those things well. And then the night in the valley 40 kilometers east had happened, and the category had been erased, and what was left was not a new category but the absence of one. In the absence of one, she had made herself something else. Not a soldier, not an asset, not a ghost, despite what the designation people preferred to reach for. Something older than any of those things, and more specific. A person in a specific landscape, doing a specific work, for reasons that did not require external validation, because they had been arrived at in isolation and tested against the most demanding testing conditions available, which was simply, "Are you still alive?" And the answer, again and again, was yes. She thought about the 18th mark. She thought about Gerald Barton and the 300 meters he'd made, and the cover that might have been, that she was not yet willing to declare impossible. She had looked. She would look again in the spring when the snowmelt revealed the terrain below the line where she'd last searched. She would look again because the account was not closed, and the account was not closed because she had decided it was not closed, and her decisions in this terrain were the only authority she recognized. She pulled back her sleeve. The 17 complete marks. The 18th, half drawn. She pulled the sleeve back down. She looked north, toward the deeper valley, toward the terrain that she knew the way. Hollis had said she knew it from the inside, from the bones, from 18 months of continuous presence through every season and every weather system and every minor catastrophe the landscape could produce. The snow was coming harder now. She turned north and walked into it. Her footprints appeared behind her, clean and evenly spaced in the fresh snow. After a few minutes, the wind erased them. After a few minutes more, there was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Only the valley, only the snow, only the cold that had no interest in anyone's survival and no grudge against it either. And somewhere in the storm, moving north, a figure with ink on her hands and a bolt-action rifle and a count of 17 and a fraction moving quietly and steadily. The way she moved, the way she had always moved in this terrain, as though she belonged to it or it belonged to her or the distinction had ceased, somewhere in the past 18 months, to mean anything at all. You survived. She had said it to him, but she thought it now in reference to herself, not with pride, not with relief, but with the particular flat acknowledgement of someone who had decided, a long time ago, that surviving was the work, and the work continued. And you did not take breaks from work for which there was no one else available. The storm closed around her. The valley returned to its silence. The snow fell on, indifferent and complete, covering everything that had happened here. The way it covered everything that had ever happened in any valley it had ever touched, without judgment, without record, without anything except the simple fact of its own continuation, which was, perhaps, the only kind of completion any of it would ever get.